Kerensky, he got to know Trotsky. I mean, he wrote this book, 10 Days That Shook the World. And it really is stirring stuff. The film Reds is brilliantly done. It's a love story because Jack Reed and his girlfriend Louise Bryant had a passionate, amazing love story woven around the events of the revolution. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. And it is shocking how there were like 10 countries all tried to intervene to suppress the Bolsheviks with armies, including the French, the British, everyone else. Again, I would say as a peace thinker that initially the Bolshevik Revolution was quite peaceful. It didn't require huge bloodshed. It wasn't like a huge thing going on. It was a relatively peaceful takeover. It's an interesting thought experiment in history. If the Allies hadn't tried to crush it militarily, if they hadn't armed counter-revolutionary forces, the Whites, which then caused this huge civil war, and instead supported the early communist government and said, yes, let's have peace throughout Europe. Because the communists got into power, they were supported by the masses because they wanted peace. They didn't want to go on fighting the war against Germany. They wanted a truce, a non-violence treaty with Germany. What was wrong with that? What if that had sent a signal and all of Europe had then declared peace? I think what was going on was the military forces behind World War I, including in Britain and France and elsewhere in America, didn't want peace. They wanted endless war, and they wanted to punish Germany irrationally, actually, because Germany wasn't solely responsible for this war. Two recent Scottish historians have discovered and dug up papers that actually the British deliberately goaded the German Emperor, the Kaiser, into launching the war. So history can shed even more light on that. So, yes, if only. I mean, history is a whole bunch of if-onlys. If only the Kaiser had stayed up in his loch, in his fjord in Norway, and not come back that fatal autumn to launch World War I. If only the Allies had not intervened to take down the new Bolshevik regime and actually helped it, saying, yeah, okay, we're going to help you. You've chosen the peace path. Well, we're going to help you with that. We like peace too. It seems to me the losers in history are peace, often. There were people active in Switzerland, there were socialists, there were feminists, there were people trying to say, let's have peace. Lenin was sort of on the fringes of that lot, but he said, yes, to get peace, we have to seize power and take over the state. Which, in the end, had catastrophic results. So anyway, history, isn't it fascinating? If you look at it from all angles, it's like, gosh, that's why I love it. It's so fascinating. So thank you. But what is history? When I went to Moscow in 1990 for my first ever conference of philosophers for peace, and I met some brilliant Russian intellectuals and from other countries around the world. I was representing Britain. We discussed this. What is peace? How can we as intellectuals help get peace? This was just before Gorbachev was overthrown in a coup. Gorbachev was still the president of what was still then the USSR. Gorbachev wanted peace. I don't think he foresaw that by signing the Peace Treaty of Paris in 1990, that NATO and the West would sort of tear up the unwritten clauses. Gorbachev got verbal agreement from the West not to start putting bases around Russia. And he trusted the honour of America and the West. With hindsight, that was a mistake from a Russian point of view. So there's many questions to be answered. Is history simply the product of whoever wins the battles and creates the biggest propaganda machinery? What happens to truth? Well, as you know, as a philosopher, I'm a great believer in truth. and veracity. And this is why I've campaigned for a Parliamentary Veracity Bill. Ever since 2015, I proposed it in my blog that all parliamentarians in the UK and other countries should have to swear an oath of veracity. We can't have leaders in a mature democracy who simply lie and get away with it. I mean, there's no other profession where you can do that. If you're a policeman, you're found to lie, you get sacked. If you're a teacher, you know, if I lie in school setting, you know, I'd be sacked, quite rightly, you know. In medicine, if I lie, no, I didn't, you know, do that. Yes, you did. I would lose my job as a doctor. So I think politicians should be brought into the daylight. We have a duty and a right to expect our political leaders, who we elect, and they get quite a lot of money, they get a lot of perks, that they should have to tell the truth. It's absolutely basic, you know. And if they don't, you get a divorce. There's a new election, and that person never stands for office again. They're discredited. It will come, you know, that to me would be a real revolution. The revolution worth fighting for is the one that brings truth into politics. Okay, so I want to talking about that. Let me turn to the question of the COVID and the horrible, you know, pandemic we're all suffering from still, and it's not gone away. What is the truth about that? There's a whole bunch of vicious and violent and conflict-ridden debates going on in the media and the social media and so on about, you know, what is this vaccine? What's the best way to treat it? There's a whole debate about should we treat it with vaccine, shouldn't we? I'm kind of neutral on that. I'm an agnostic. My interest is in the etiology of the vaccine, as my colleagues know. And I'm saying as an intellectual, we should find out what caused this thing first. Suspend judgment. So I've set up this International Commission of Inquiry into the etiology of COVID-19. And I'm in touch with virologist experts giving their different opinions. I'm neutral on the question of how's best to treat it. What I'm saying is that my job is to find out the etiology, the cause of it. That will also then condition partly how we treat it. And, you know, American intelligence has now set up a unit under Biden to look at the etiology of this thing. And there are other groups, but my commission is you know, not attached to any government. It's a fact-finding thing, and people are calling for something like this. So let's all work together. Let's collaborate. Let's share data. The Paris Peace Forum is having a meeting tomorrow, which I will attend, on vaccination and how to you know, cure the disease and so on. I will attend it, but I wonder if they're going to discuss anything to do with etiology. I'll try and raise it if I can, because I think it is quite important. Okay, so that raises the question: what is truth then? You know, is there such a thing? Well, this is where philosophy comes in. I mean, if absolute relativism is true, then nobody's version of truth is any more significant than anyone else's, and there's only a million different competing narratives, all of which clamour for, look at me, I'm the truth, you know. But actually, there's no way of distinguishing between them all. They're just, truth is whatever I want to believe in. And unfortunately, we seem to have ended up in that place, and partly it's a result of social media, because it amplifies every single voice to the same pitch. And somebody that spent 30, 40 years studying, you know, a topic has the same pitch as someone who's just, you know, read 2 books and listened to a YouTube video and has spent 3 days on it. How can you differentiate between, you know, whose truth is true? Well, fortunately, we have this thing called philosophy, and it's been going for a long time, and that is the science or discipline of how we learn the skills to differentiate between what is true truth and what is fake truth. And I've been studying philosophy myself for, you know, a long time, and am a great fan of the assembled evidence of philosophy. Read. I always tell my students, read the dialogues of Plato. If you want to study philosophy, the first thing, just go away and read the whole thing, and then you'll begin to see what depths are in philosophy. Because Socrates, he didn't go around Athens saying, "Hey, listen to me, I'm the truth." No, he said, we need a method to try and get to the truth. First off, let's call it discussion. Let's have a dialogue, because that is sort of Jeffersonian in that we have a community of truth seekers, and we have a democratic system whereby all our voices are important. So let's start with that dialogue process. Dialectic, it's called in the Socratic tradition. And then each person put their viewpoint forward on whatever the topic is, justice or liberty or wisdom or love. And then truth might emerge from that discussion. Truth could be an emergent property of disagreement. There should be certain ground rules to the discussion, that we don't kill the guy if we don't agree with them. We listen to them and then put counter arguments. So we invent reason, we invent logic to to differentiate between hysterical assertions, no, this is the truth, that's it, versus this seems to be, on the evidence we have, this seems to be the most likely version of truth. And then Aristotle came along and sort of tried to develop a systematic way of creating those logic systems to differentiate between different forms of truth, different assertions, different statements. Well, they can be analysed, they can be studied. Are they logically true? That's what I'm trying to do with my commission, the International Commission of Inquiry into the Aetiology of COVID. Let's look at this logically. Where did it come from? And rather than being told, well, you're not a scientist, you don't know enough about it. Well, hang on, I am a philosopher, I am a scientist, I'm a philosopher of science, and it's actually up to the scientists, so-called, to explain in language that other intellectuals can understand what they know and what they don't know about the etiology of this thing. Because this is a pandemic affecting, it's killed nearly 4 million people, and it's impacted on the lives and well-being and emotional well-being of millions more. This is a global tragedy. So the scientists that do have specialised knowledge about virology and possibly etiology should explain that in as near a possible normal language to us generalists, and I'll continue to push for that. So what is true? Is there a truth in a bigger, a more extended sense? Is there some people say only God can know the truth. I mean, I've had this discussion with people, that theists that say, no, only God knows the truth. Well, what is God? If God is the sort of collective storehouse consciousness of all beings that have ever existed, how can you access that realm? Well, that's where what's called prophetic intelligence comes in. Certain individuals seem to have been able to cultivate their spiritual acumen to a point of clarity they can download from that collective alaya vijnana, to use the Buddhist term for collective storehouse consciousness, and they can download that prophetic message or insight. And one of those was Muhammad, bless him, who gave us the Quran, and who brought down these messages from that collective storehouse consciousness. That's why I spent 10 years of my life studying and commenting on it in detail, because I think it's very insightful as to what the collective consciousness actually wants from humanity. And, it's not a surprise that what that collective storehouse consciousness wants is peace, justice, help for the poor, help for the victims of warfare, help for the widow, the orphan, help for the disadvantaged in society, not just more wealth and power to the elites. The message in the Quran is absolutely crystal clear if you read it, listen to my commentary. It's like going back to the metaphysics that Moses Hess was talking about, the communistic essence, which Engels and Marx ruined by their materialism, which is this spiritual interconnectedness of all being and all humanity. Where Muhammad was going for his inspiration in his cave in Hira, Mount Hira near Mecca, and then elsewhere, was from that same place that Moses Hess was downloading, and all the great geniuses of history, the intellectual philosophers and prophets of history, have been going to the same place. Now, I've been reading and studying since we last spoke an amazing new book that's come out about Ali. Now, Ali was a relative of the Prophet. He was the son of the Prophet's uncle, Abu Talib, who defended Muhammad when he had no real supporters. And Ali and Muhammad were as close as like your best brother kind of thing. They were cousins. And then Ali married his daughter, Fatima, who was the apple of Muhammad's eye, his wife Khadija, and he doted on Fatima, who was a beautiful, amazing woman, highly intelligent, to die for, gorgeous, person. And Ali loved her to bits. And this was the Prophet's family, And just before the Prophet died, he said in a public statement, look, Ali is my successor. He said on many other occasions that Ali knew more about the Quran than anyone else. He'd been with the Prophet many times when he'd received these downloads, and he was assigned by the Prophet the right to write them up, because Ali was literate. And in my commentary on the Quran, I've gone into all this. Ali was incredibly important for these reasons, and it's said that Ali was the only one that really knew intimately the inner meaning of the Quran. And he said at one point he could write reams of commentaries just on one of the surahs, which would fill 70 camel loads of manuscripts. Ali was a true seer and a sage, as well as the first imam, the first person to bring spiritual reason to bear on the prophetic legacy. So, I've been reading in great detail what happened, and I want to share it a bit. Most people in the West don't know this story, and it is important, and I'll explain why as we go along. And it's also, you need to be both a philosopher and a historian to understand this. But this goes back to the dynamic of what I can call the dialectics of good and evil that weave throughout history. I mean, I'm a historian, first and foremost, but I'm also a philosopher of history, because I look at history and the events of history and I say, golly gosh, did that really happen? Like, how evil that is. And constantly, humanity is making these terrible mistakes, self-destructive, killing millions, and yet we keep letting it happen generation after generation. To me, Brexit is a cataclysmic mistake which is going to cause all kinds of suffering, and already has. And yet, look, it happened on my watch. Why are these people so stupid? Well, the Ali story is another example of the stupidity of man in action. And it's really tragic. So if you don't know this story, please listen and learn from it. So there's Ali, great friend, best friend of Muhammad, his great supporter, the second ever Muslim after Khadija. He became the first ever Muslim. And he's there when the Quran's being transmitted. He understands its inner meaning. So the Prophet dies, having said, Ali's my successor. And is he made the successor? Is he made the Caliph? No, he's not. There's a sort of a stitch-up job. There's a little secret meeting takes place to which Ali's not invited, and they appoint instead Abu Bakr, who's a businessman and a sort of a leading Muslim establishment figure, who didn't understand the inner meanings of the Quran, didn't understand the real message of Islam. And that's proved because what immediately starts doing is launching a war on everyone that didn't agree with his version of Islam, called the Ridda Wars. For 2 years, he wages war against all the Arabian tribes that didn't buy into his version of what Muhammad said. Well, come on, that's not That's not Islam, that's just warfare, that's business, like a business opportunity by conquering other tribes. Ali's sitting there, you know, really frustrated and you know, just really sad, probably crying a lot, because what is going on here? Then Abu Bakr dies after only a couple of years, and he hands on his succession to a chap called Umar in 634. Now Umar is another of these big businessmen, doesn't have a clue what real Islam is, and in fact so much so that when he started out he wanted to destroy Islam, and he nearly killed the Prophet. So he was a really big, angry, volatile kind of chap, and he went to the Prophet's house to kill him one time. So that's how much of a Muslim he is. Now he said that he had a conversion and decided not to, and you know, became a Muslim, but I wouldn't trust people like that. You know, if somebody walked in my house to kill me and then left after an hour saying, "Oh no, he's quite a good bloke, I won't kill him," I certainly wouldn't trust them to succeed with my entire mission as an intellectual and philosopher and all the rest of it. So anyway, that chap, the guy that tried to kill the Prophet, becomes the Caliph. I mean, you couldn't make this up. This is a nightmare, right? Poor old Ali is like, what can I do? You know, he just was wanting to be a scholar. I wish Ali at this point had written his commentary on the Quran. It's one of the tragedies of history that his wife should have just like shut him in the room and made him write the commentary on every verse of the Quran, like I'm trying to do now. And during this time, Omar just took this business opportunity of warfare to its pinnacle. He attacked Syria. He expelled all the Jews and Christians from the whole of Arabia. Like he was, he was anti-Jewish and anti-Christian. His version of Islam was like, you accept what I say or I kill you. Now that's not what the Prophet had said. The Prophet was much more tolerant and moderate and much more intellectual, much cleverer, much kinder and wiser. And had actually, just before he died, he'd sent Ali down to the Yemen in the south of Arabia because there was a very important Christian community down there in a place called Najran. They had churches, they had the Bible, they had Arabian Christians, right? And the Prophet wrote them a letter, Ali delivered it, saying, "Hey Christians, there's a new prophet on the block, it's me, Muhammad, come and join the movement." And those Christians sent a delegation up to see the Prophet of 60 people. They travelled up from the Yemen to come and visit the Prophet, and they were, up for being convinced because it was exciting. God's sending a new messenger, let's listen. But in the end, Muhammad and the Christian, delegation decided to agree to differ. 45 of the Christians were scholars. They were biblical scholars. They knew their New Testament. And there was an agreement. Okay, we don't agree on everything. But they made a peace treaty called the Treaty the Treaty with the Najran Christians, which is very, very famous. And it was an interfaith peace treaty. Muhammad pledged the Muslims will never attack Christians. They will protect them. They will protect their churches. No Muslim is allowed to attack Christians or damage their buildings. And no Christians will ever attack Muslims. It was it was a two-way thing. And that they would honour the Muslims, although they didn't agree with everything about their revelation. They respected them. There were aspects, no doubt, of the Quran that appealed to them. And I'm not sure how much of the Quran was then available to share because it wasn't in sort of one book form. It was scattered at that time. But that was a really important thing. And it's a sign that if Muhammad had lived or if Ali had succeeded, because Ali's there in these negotiations, there wouldn't have been all these tyrannical extensions of Islam as a business, a war business. But unfortunately, because Omar is now in charge, he kicks all the Jews and Christians out of Arabia. He then goes off with an army and conquers Persia in 636, having conquered Syria. And then he attacks the Byzantines in 637, who lose a famous battle at Yarmouk. So Islam armies marching, triumphant battle-winning project very much, that's what's happening here. And anybody wants to get in and capture some booty and some slaves and all the rest of it. But Ali is biding his time. He's not with this project. This is not Islam. He knows. And I wish to God he'd been writing his commentary on the Quran and opposing it as a dissident from within. And then Omar goes and conquers Jerusalem in 637, takes it over, and conquers Egypt and founds Cairo. So, very successful in that outer conquest sort of way, but then losing the plot as to what Islam truly means, because the true meaning that Muhammad had was very different to what is now happening. And Ali knew that. Then Omar is assassinated. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword, as George Fox said. And he's assassinated by a Persian slave, because he's really annoyed that Omar's conquered his Persian people. Okay, so then what happens? Well, he delegates Uthman to take over as caliph. So Ali's passed over yet again, and Uthman knew even less about true Islam. Uthman was from the very group of Arabians in Mecca that had opposed Muhammad right down to the wire. They hated Muhammad because he threatened their trading, because his newfangled ideas of peace with Jews, Muslims, Christians, everyone together was a sort of threat to their ideology of hatred. The word Quraysh actually comes from the word for a shark. These Quraysh tribes of Arabians running Mecca were pretty fierce. They were sharks, and they used the shark as the emblem of their, of their tribe, and so Uthman was from that background. What did he do? Well, he appointed all his relatives to positions of power all over the empire. He appointed one of his relatives to Egypt, to Syria, to Persia, and he created a nepotistic, system, which was based on, like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and here's some money, and send me some troops, and so on. Now, this chap Uthman, who was a pretty ferocious and un-Islamic chap, was ruling in the name of Islam because it seemed like a good slogan to get in on. It was a franchise, and so if you turn up, capture a city and say you're Muslim, then you've got a sort of rationale for tyrannizing everyone. Well, that was a million miles away from what Muhammad wanted and from what Ali knew Muhammad wanted. He wanted no compulsion in matters of religion. That was what Muhammad said. He wanted a true inner conversion to the one, not a sort of fake conversion at the point of a sword, but a true transformation of the human spirit to love, to peace, to wisdom. But no, Uthman is tyrannizing, and then, because, and this goes back to the question of propaganda and intellectual control, he then says, well, we're only going to have one Quran. So Uthman sets up a committee which then is going to produce the Quran. Because it's dangerous. These people have got messages from Muhammad that might challenge me. I'm Uthman. I say, when you have a slave, you can kill them, do whatever you want with them. Well, if they turn up with a verse they say is from Muhammad and it says, no, you can't do that to your slaves, well, that's no good, is it? So what Uthman did was create this committee and collate all the manuscripts, all the scraps of palm leaves and parchment that the thing had been written on, and appoint people to then come up with the version. Ali didn't sit on this commission. He wasn't invited, and yet Ali was the key guy that knew more about it than anyone. And he then produced the Quran that we have today, and then he did something absolutely tyrannical. He ordered every single other copy of every other trace of bits and fragments of the Quran destroyed. So we only have the Uthman version. Well, that's what tyrants do, Anyway, so Ali's watching all this, and meanwhile, his own wife Fatima is being tyrannized. And her house was ransacked. She herself was injured by a door that fell on her. She was pregnant and she died soon after. The daughter of the Prophet. So that's how much disrespect was being shown to Fatima and to Ali. And it's absolutely disgraceful. So, and then Uthman loses a ring that belonged to Muhammad. They were quite a superstitious people, and that seemed like it was a sign that Uthman was no longer in the favour of Muhammad. And everything started going wrong. People started opposing him, and there was a rebellion against him finally. And he was assassinated by the son of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, who'd had enough. This guy Uthman was a tyrant. He was misbehaving. And so he was killed. And then they they turned round to Ali and said, look, you seem to be the only last real surviving Muslim on the block here. Please become the caliph. They appointed him. And Ali had not engineered any of this. He'd not supported violent revolution against Uthman. He'd not opposed any of these three caliphs violently, but he knew that they were not the real rulers of Islam. They were fakes. They were just businessmen. Like Boris Johnson is a fake prime minister. He's not really the prime minister of my country. We all know that. He's a fake. He's a businessman. He's just been put in power by the cabal that run the Tory party and run Britain's military industrial complex and, are the warlords of our day, just as Uthman was the warlord in his day. So anyway, Ali did his best. He became caliph in 656. And he made speeches. He said, look, I'm going to rule on behalf of all the Muslims, and you will judge me on how much I help the poorest among you, whether I give succor to the needy. That's what a true Muslim does. He lived in a very simple way. He didn't amass huge personal wealth. He refused to tax people that couldn't afford taxes. He insisted that Muslim governors look after the non-Muslims in their communities, Christians, Jews, whatever, that they don't tyrannize them. He wanted true Islam to come in, and his speeches that have come down are full of that. The trouble was, he couldn't suppress or he tried to replace the governor in Syria, who was the nastiest of the bunch, a guy called Muawiyah, who'd been appointed by Uthman, right? Very violent chap. And he couldn't because Muawiyah was a real tyrant, had created his own little army and told Ali to get lost. Ali then had to cope with a revolt in his own territory around Medina from Zalha and Zubayr, supported by the last youngest wife of the Prophet, Aisha, who, with all due respect, didn't really have a clue about the real history of Muhammad. She'd never been there. She didn't understand the Quran. She'd been a little girl when she first got betrothed to Muhammad, and she wasn't an intellectual with a proper understanding of Islam, and she hated Ali. She was jealous of him, and she had that hysterical kind of jealousy, and got talked into having a physical armed revolt against him, which really upset Ali, because Ali didn't want to have to fight this wife of the Prophet, Aisha. But she launched this war. There was a battle of the camel, and she lost. They lost. Ali's army won, but they were very generous to Aisha. They let her go back and live, and didn't persecute her or anything. Ali was very